right, good afternoon, everyone. Let's get started. All right, so today is Thursday, October 3rd. We are at the end of week 6. Okay, so a couple of quick reminders slash announcements. So we are we have posted homework 3. Okay, so this is the third homework. Same thing. So we're posting right now. You have 1 week to finish it. Okay, make sure you submit by before next Thursday class. Okay, so this homework will have separate links for the undergraduate section and the graduate section. Okay, so just make sure you submit to the correct one. Okay, we also got a couple of questions regarding the midterm exam and also the final project. So I want to just talk a little about that in terms, because I think some of you probably can, in terms of your scheduling, right? So midterm exam, we're planning that for week 10. Okay, so that's roughly like 4 weeks away. Okay. Looking at the current schedule, we're kind of on schedule, so we should be able to have, I'm planning probably the 29th, so we're going to talk about like previous year's exams, so just give you a sense of what kind of questions will be tested in the midterm exam. And then the 31st during class is when we're going to have the exam. Okay, so we do have the in-person sections and the asynchronous sections. So we will be sending out a survey to check about people's availability. So if you're in the in-person section, we do expect you to be here in person, right? I know some students will need special accommodation, so we'll work out some of the details there. If you're in the online section, I think we should have enough space. I think some of you asked whether you can come in. Yes, you can. I think we should have enough space to accommodate some students who are in the online section. Okay, and then for those who cannot come in person, then we need to set up remote mechanism to do it. So just watch out for a survey probably the week before, so we can get people's availability and any special accommodations that we need to plan out. But the plan is to have the midterm exam in week 10. Okay, any questions there? Good. Okay, just put that on your calendar. Okay, that's our plan. And then the final project presentations, as we have said before, so we are going to finish in the last week of a class, which is week 16, okay? The Tuesday and the Thursday of that week is the December 10th and the 12th, okay? So December 12th is the last day of a class, okay? So we're planning to finish then. So the last week, we're going to schedule our final project presentations, okay? So it's similar to your proposal meeting, but it'll be a bit more expanded, because by then you should have finished your project, okay? So we will still do the scheduling the week ahead, so we can actually have everybody scheduled. But the plan is to finish by December 12th. Okay. So a few of you have asked about leaving earlier or remote participation. As said, generally, if you're in the online section, it's fine. You can join remotely, right? But for the in-person section, the expectation that you will be here presenting in person. Okay. So if you have any special situations, let us know when we do the survey, so we can work out a plan. So December 12th, that's when we do the final presentations. After that, you have a few days. I think we'll probably set it until the Sunday or Monday, so that you can submit your final project documents. Okay, so that'll be your slides, your report, and also we'll be asking for zip code of your code and the results. Okay, zip file, not zip code. So we don't have final exam. So technically, if you need to travel after December 12th, it's okay for this class. Okay, if you have any other special circumstances, talk to me and we'll see what is possible. Okay, any questions? Homework 3, midterm exam, final project presentations. Hopefully that gives you a sense of our schedule. All right? Oh, one more thing I want to mention. I think we mentioned this at the very beginning of the class, but just a reminder. So we still have 2 more homeworks. Okay, so after homework 3, we have homework 4 and 5. Okay? So 2 more homeworks, and then we're going to be ready. So that will get us to week 9. Okay, so week 9, we're going to do a review of the for the midterm exam, just to prep you, and then we're going to post previous years of midterm exam, so you can see what kind of questions. Then we'll talk about the exam, previous year's exam. On the 29th, 31st is the test. So as you can see, after midterm exam, basically there's no more homeworks. So you have roughly 5 weeks, because there's a fall break in between, right? Roughly 5 weeks to focus on your course project, okay? So just you plan that accordingly, okay? Any questions? Good? All right, okay. So if you no questions, we'll move along with our lecture. So in the previous section, we finished the last bit of chapter 4, okay, which is basically talking about how you evaluate whether a pattern you have found is interesting or not, right? So we were talking about correlation, right? So there are actually quite a few different metrics you can use to measure correlation, okay? They have different properties, okay? The main thing is about this null transaction, okay? So whether your metric is considering null transactions or not. Okay, so we have said that in the real world, many times the null transaction would be dominating, right? The actual occurrences of events. So as a result, right, you need to reason about whether you need to choose a metric that can be null invariant, meaning that they don't consider, right? They wouldn't be skewed by the number of null transactions you have in the data set. Okay, we then continue talking about chapter 5, okay? So here we're talking about more advanced methods related to pattern mining, okay? So chapter 4, we're talking about the basic idea, right? What is a frequent pattern? What is a frequent item set? We'll talk about some methods that can be used and also how you measure interestness, right? But then chapter 5 is, okay, yes, you can find the frequent patterns, but there are actually many types of patterns, right? When you consider real-world scenarios, okay? So we started talking about what types of patterns, okay, going from the single level, single dimension, right, or binary attribute values. Then you can talk about multi-level because different granularity may be used when you're considering different types of patterns, right? And also dimensions, right? So you may be considering different dimensions when you're trying to pull the pattern, right? You may have age information, annual income, or say the purchase pattern, but on top of that, right? So we also talk about how you can work with different types of attributes, right? Remember, attribute types can be binary simple, like whether you're buying this thing or not, but you can also have some kind of categorical values or numerical values, okay? Categorical values are usually easier because what you're counting is really just the occurrence of the exact same thing, right? But numerical values is trickier because you cannot just count the very different values, right? You're really looking at the grouping, so how you actually group those values together. Okay, so we'll talk about static discretization, right? You can do dynamic discretization, clustering, right? Those are all ways for you to group values so that you can find, right, the frequent patterns, okay? And then we start talking about compressed and approximate patterns. Here, the main idea is that you want to find the patterns that are, of course, frequent, significant, right? But you don't want to find any patterns that are too similar to each other, okay? Because that's basically about how you want to find things that are significant but different. Okay, so we were using this idea about some kind of measure for the pattern proximity. Okay, so it's basically talking about how much of those patterns overlap, right, compared to the individual size of those patterns. Okay, so that'll give us a way to kind of balance, right, balance between how many patterns we find, whether they're significant, but also how we identify the representative, but also differentiating patterns. Okay. Constraint-based pattern, here is where we try to incorporate, right, a lot more kind of information from the users, from the domain, so that you can guide your pattern mining process, right? Because in the real world, usually you don't want to just throw in all your data and just ask for give me everything, right? That'd be too many, okay? It'll be wasting a lot of your time and you may not find the most interesting one, okay? So instead, you usually have some kind of idea or knowledge. So that's also something we've been kind of reminding the groups, right, in your project as well, right? When you go in, you have some questions or some hypotheses in mind, right? That'll help you to guide your process so that you don't have to just blindly, right, check everything, okay? So we particularly talk about the patterns that the constraints, right, with certain properties. Anybody remember those terms? We talk about quite a few terms. Anybody? So if this pattern is violating the constraint, then any superset would also violate. What is that property? Anybody remember?
Is it
Anti-monotonicity. So that means if like one violates, any superset will also violate. So you can remove it, right? Ignore it, so that you don't need to consider anyway. Or it could be the other way. If your question is about like satisfying the constraint, then say, okay, if currently you already satisfy, and with this property, then your superset is also guaranteed to satisfy, right? So that's what we say if you're talking about the range, right? The range would only grow, it cannot shrink when you add new items, right? So those are the kind of properties we're trying to leverage so that you can like kind of filter things, right? So you can prune out things along your process, because the whole process of a pattern mining is that you're considering different possibilities, right? If you don't do anything else, it could be like a very large like combination of space. It's huge, right? So you're trying to use all kinds of like constraints so that you can, right, remove things or reduce the space you have to look at, okay? So we talk about anti-monotonic, monotonic, succinct. Okay, that's the basis of whether you can enumerate, right, all the possible patterns that would satisfy, that is needed to satisfy the particular property or the constraint, okay? We also talk about convertible constraints. So that means convertible, basically, if I can, right, sort the items in certain order, okay? So if I can control the order of adding certain items, then I have certain property I can utilize. So average is the example we're using, right? Because the average, if you don't have a control of the order, then your value can go up and down randomly, depending on which values you're looking at. But if you have a way to sort it upward or downward, right, then your average would only go up or down. And that is the property you can leverage. Okay, so like at a high level, we're basically saying that, okay, all those constraints, right, you don't need to memorize it, but I want you to be able to kind of reason about it, okay? So if I'm giving you a constraint and say whether this is anti-monotonic or monotonic, right, you want to be able to do reasoning. But what you're saying is that, okay, if the current item set, right, satisfies or violates a particular constraint, what does it mean? And then you look at the constraint itself, you look at the function, and to utilize certain property, right? Average going up or down, range going up or down, minimal price, maximal price, right? So those are all things that you may be to reason about so that you can say that whether this is a particular property or not, okay? With all that, right, the goal is to prune. If you remember at the very end, we had the table kind of summarizing, right, anti-monotonic, monotonic, succinct, so you can use those kind of constraints to prune out patterns along the way, okay? And we had an example, if you remember, right? With the basic priori algorithm, we can prune out certain patterns, right? But with the constraints, we can remove some more patterns, okay, or earlier, so that you don't have to consider those patterns. Okay, so we have a few kind of topics in this chapter, okay? The textbook has a lot more details, okay? So if you want to dive in, it's a lot, okay? But for our purpose, I will just briefly talk about the high-level ideas and point you to some methods, okay? So if you're interested and if it's relevant for your course project, yes, you can definitely dive into and use some of the references to kind of learn more about those. But for the purpose of the just course, I want you to have the high-level conceptual understanding, and that is sufficient, okay? All right, so sequential patterns. So this is related to our earlier discussion about what is a pattern, right? When you have item sets, right, transactions, say individual transactions, so within the same transaction, those items, they have no order, right? It's just a set, okay? So when there's no order, we talk about how you can find frequent item sets, right? But if you look at multiple transactions, right, from the same customer, okay? Now you have a sequence, right? So the idea is that you may have patterns, right, that is happening and they have certain order to it, okay? So think about some of the examples, right, where you have sequential information, okay? Customer shopping of the set, right, if we say it's not just a one-time purchase, it's about kind of like a sequence of purchases. And you're trying to look for some kind of ordering, right? This is a simple example. Purchase a laptop and then purchase a digital camera and then purchase a smartphone. It may or may not be the most frequent, but that is something you can look at okay? Many other scenarios like scientific experiments, that's another one, right? Usually when you design your experiment, you have certain like procedure to follow, okay? And that is, again, the order we're trying to look at, right, to see whether there's some kind of frequent occurrences, okay? Biological sequence, the DNA, protein, this is also where the sequence matters a lot, okay? So not only about the core occurrence, but it's more about the sequence, okay? And in this case, right, the sequence may or may not be like adjacent to each other. Rather, just A happened before B, right? B happened before C, okay? So that's about the sequence, just it's about before, after. How is this different from time series? Sequential data versus temporal data.
Maybe you don't have the nice linear progression that you do with time.
So with the time, you have a notion about how much of spacing, right? For example, if I do my purchase, grocery shopping, I probably do this maybe weekly, right? You may have a nice weekly pattern. But if I'm only talking about sequential pattern, I care less about whether it's between, say you did this like one week ago, 1 day ago, even just 1 hour ago, right? So we're not using the notion of timestamps, okay? So sequential pattern generally is more about sequence, the order, okay? But time series is actually also very useful information, right? It has more detailed information. So that's why if you're talking about like traffic patterns, right? Sometimes you care actually about like the time or the time duration between things, okay? Stock price, that may be another one, right? How quickly things are happening, or like the rough like amount of time periods, okay? So for your problem, right? Then of course the reason about, yeah, I have time series of data, but maybe it's sufficient I find some sequential pattern, right? Or I have some way of incorporating the time information and really need to work with them as time series, okay? So just keep that in mind as you're like working with sequential pattern or like you have time series data. Okay, so at a very basic, right, we need a way to, of course, like represent, okay, sequence, okay? So if you look at if you remember our earlier like a transaction table, okay? So we have transaction ID and then we have the items, right? Usually listed in alphabetical order, but really it's just a set of items, okay? But now we have sequence, okay? So we have our sequence database. Now you see we have a little bit like a more specific notation here. So what we're trying to do is that, okay, at any order, like a sequence, right, you have a few elements. This is what we're referring to as elements or events, okay? And within each element or event, you could have multiple things happening together. So it's like one particular purchase, right, may have multiple items in it, but that is one instance, okay, one event, okay? And now you have the sequence, right, of a few different things. Okay, so that's how we're writing things out. So if you look at the sequence table example there, right, what basically saying is that, okay, first A occurred, right, and then ABC as a whole has occurred, okay. After that, AC has occurred, and then D and then CF together, right? So when you have like a way of organizing this as a sequence, then the idea of like frequent sequential pattern is very similar to our definition of a frequent item sets, right? Whatever pattern, right? You just want to count how often it has occurred in your data set and whether that occurrence is above your threshold, okay? That's a process, right? So in our simple example, I only have 4 sequences, okay? But you can see, right, I highlighted A, B, and then C, okay? So you can see, right, A, B occurring together, and then sometime later, C may occur. Again, right, I'm going to say, like, it doesn't matter how much has happened in between, as long as, like, there's a C happening after the AB in the event, okay? So in this case, my minimal support is 2, and A, B, C as a sequence, right, has occurred at least twice, so that is considered a frequent sequential pattern, okay? So the definition is simple, okay? But compared with the frequent item set mining, do you think like finding the sequential pattern is about like similar complexity or is like more? Which one has a higher complexity? Similar or one is higher than the other? Yes, sequential would intuitively, right, would be like of higher complexity because now you're talking about a combination, right, of the ordered combination rather than just like union things together, okay? So it turns out it's much harder to do this, okay? You can take the like a basic a priori algorithm, okay, and then just trying to expand it, right? With a priori, remember what we're doing is that, okay, you have the current frequent item sets, you expand it to generate the candidates, okay? Now with the sequential patterns, you can still generate candidates, but there are many possible combinations, okay? So you can still do it, right? Generate the candidates, check the support, come back and grow it further, right, to get the next round, okay? So that's actually what the basic, the GSP. So it's a generalized sequential patterns, okay? So that was an earlier like method, but again, quickly, people realize it's not scalable, okay? You cannot work with like large number of sequence information, okay? So there are a few other methods. Some of those we have kind of like mentioned, okay? So like vertical data format, you will see actually the vertical data format actually can be quite useful, right? When you're trying to combine, right, two different sequence or subsequences, okay? Pattern growth, that's kind of a little bit similar to the FP growth thing we have been talking about, okay? So not trying to generate the candidates and test and then remove, you're basically trying to generate like sequential patterns that are guaranteed, right, to be frequent, okay? Closed pattern is another idea, okay? We already mentioned like closed pattern is the superset, right? The largest, like the longest subsequence that is still frequent, right, with certain support value, okay? So when you do that, then you also need to reduce the amount of calculations when dealing with the smaller like subsequences, okay? Constraint-based, that's another one, right? That is also a very useful way for you to tailor your pattern mining process and making the whole process more efficient, okay? So those are just pointers, okay? As I said, the textbook has more details, and if you check out the papers, the original papers, they have more details, okay? But for the purpose of this course, I just want you to have high-level understanding, right, about what is a sequential pattern, okay? What do we mean by sequential pattern mining, okay? And some of the at the top, right, what do you care about? It's about efficiency, you want to be scalable, and also like the incorporate the user-specific constraints, right? That's the high-level idea about how you can leverage constraints for finding specific types of patterns. Okay, so sequential pattern is harder, right, than item sets. And then you can make it even harder. That's even more complex. Now you have graphs, okay? Because in many real-world cases, you may have a graph data rather than item sets or like sequential data, okay? So graphs actually can be everywhere, okay? If you think about it, right? Some are physical graphs, okay? Some are like just kind of like abstract of relationships, okay? Because graphs as the abstractions are very simple, right? All you need is the vertices and the links, okay? But it can be used to represent many different types of relationships, okay? So in chemical informatics, right, mining frequent chemical compound structure, okay? So what you're looking at is that you have the graphs, right, graph structure of different compound, okay? And then what you're trying to find some similarity, right? If a certain structure tend to be frequent and they have certain properties, right, you may want to try to leverage that property and the reason about that property, and it may be helpful for you to design, for example, like new materials, okay? So that is like one example, right? You're actually looking at, right, the structure, the compound structure, okay? Or you can look at like physical networks, okay? Or, well, nowadays we're mostly wireless, but if you think about the actual cables, right, the internet, the wired network, that's a network, right? And you have a lot of things being connected, and you can actually look for frequent patterns there, okay? Or you talk about like transportation networks, the power grid, okay? So those are physical networks. Okay? And then you can create a lot of virtual networks, okay? Social networks, the World Wide Web, right? Any kind of like interactions among users. So here I have an example. So this is about co-authorship, okay? So in the research community, whenever you publish a paper, usually, right, you have co-authors, okay? So if you take all that information together, every paper give you some kind of linkage, right? You can also do a weighted graph, meaning that, yeah, we have crossovered, say, 5 papers instead of 1. You can even add in time, a constraint, right? 5 papers within the past 2 years or something. So you can actually have many different ways of constructing those kind of graphs, okay? It's very powerful because once you have the graph, right, you can use the general mechanism of graph pattern mining to find some interesting characteristics in your graph. So in this case, you may take the co-authorship or research collaboration network, right, and then you can find like frequent research collaborations, okay? So for example, it'd be interesting, like, do you think people like working in the same field tend to work together, or this is more like interdisciplinary, people coming from different fields working together? Right, and that may differ by community or by certain like research groups. Okay, so that again, like mining that kind of graph could give you some useful insights. There are many applications, so we don't need to enumerate, but here are just examples. Okay, but the high-level thing I want to mention is that with graph pattern mining is that there are all kinds of graphs, right? Real graphs or virtual graphs. Okay, and many times you can think of ways to construct a graph and then utilize graph pattern mining. Okay? And now, of course, the question, how do we do it? Right? Graph is even harder. Okay? Now, if you're looking at your candidates, right? Still, like going back to our priori algorithm, right? The idea would be that, yeah, I can grow my graph structure, right? Starting with smaller ones and growing bigger and bigger. And then checking for support, removing ones that are not frequent. You can still do it, right? Because a priori algorithm still hold whenever you're talking about frequent patterns. Because the high-level thing is still that if the substructure is not frequent, I don't need to care about anything that is the superset, right? Okay, so you can still use that property. Okay, so there's the general idea of like the generation of the candidate subgraphs. Okay, so you can grow your substructure. Okay, and then the search order is also interesting because here when you have a graph, right, you can have different ways of adding edge or vertices. Okay, and now do you want to do breadth first or depth first? Right, this is the standard thing in any search like process. Right, either say I add edge, continue adding until I have to stop and come back, or say I try different ways of adding one edge before I go to the next round of adding another edge. Okay, all those are actually different approaches, right? There's really no, let's say, one way is always better than the other. It's, again, goes back to understanding your problem, understanding your data set, okay? And then trying to utilize whatever knowledge you have to help you, to guide you, so that you can focus on the ones that are more likely to give you the patterns you're interested in quickly, okay? With the graph, there's also this angle of a duplicate, because with like, how to say, item sets, we talk about how you can like use the prefix, right? As long as the prefix match and you're only adding, like combining the last two, then you're guaranteed that this is a unique pattern, okay? But with the graphs, right, you can actually add your edges or vertices in many different ways or different order. They may end up being the same. Or if you just like rotate your graphs, right, they may also mean like similar things, okay? So another added challenge with like graph pattern mining is about this kind of duplication detection, removing duplicates, okay? And then a lot about the support calculation. We keep saying like calculating support is challenging, okay? And then like, depending on what structures you're looking at, right? You can start with a path or tree and then get to graph, okay? So again, there are quite a few references. If you're working with a graph, I think some groups are already talking about, right, constructing graphs and then trying to mine some patterns within your graphs, right? So you may take a closer look of some of those methods, okay? But at a high level, right, the idea is that you want to identify substructures, okay? Sometimes you can just generate, like this is like your like dictionary, okay? So you're generating some substructures, and like those substructures now become your keyword in some way. So if you have a big graph, right, and then you identify some substructures, okay, and that would then allow you to like quickly characterize this graph, because you say I have seen quite a few of those kind of star-shaped structures. I'm seeing quite a few of the hierarchical substructures. So those will be the things that you can leverage, okay? All right, very quickly, right? We cover like quite a lot of things quickly, but at a high level, we have been focusing more on the item sets, just knowing that they are sequential data. So you may be doing sequential pattern mining. They're also graph data. You can be finding frequent patterns in your graphs. Okay? With that, we are moving on to the next one. Okay? So chapter 4 and 5, this is about the pattern mining. Okay? So basically looking for frequent patterns. We also talk about the real patterns, negative pattern, but the general idea is that some pattern, you're basically looking at the support, right? The frequency of something happening in your data set, okay? So that'll give us actually very good knowledge about some of the kind of, say, core characteristics in your data set, okay? So that actually generally applicable. So for most of your projects, I think you should be able to do some kind of a pattern mining just to see what is, right, frequent in your data set, or what is real in your data set. Okay, moving on, we're going to talk another topic that is the core in data mining, okay? And that's also one term you probably hear a lot in the machine learning field, okay? Question is classification, okay? We're going to cover quite a few, so similar structure, right? The first chapter is talking about the basic concepts, and then we have chapter 7 that covers some of the advanced topics, okay? So we start with some basic concepts, okay? And then we'll talk about a few methods for doing classification. And then, of course, we'll care about evaluation and potential improvement. Okay. Classification, right? You probably have heard this term in many different scenarios. And sometimes you may have heard prediction, right? So first thing I want to just clarify, okay? When you say classification, so usually you have a few classes, categories, groups, right? So there are some predefined labels corresponding to different classes, groups, okay? And now you're trying to decide, right, how, like you're giving an object and you're trying to determine, like, which group or which class this object belongs to, okay? So classification is actually typically used, for example, if you're talking about object, right, classification. Like if you see an object, is this a car, is this a dog, is this an airplane, is this a plant, something, right? So usually you have a finite number of classes, okay? And you're trying to find some property about those objects. So you have a way of deciding, right, which class belongs to, okay? Safe versus risky, this is actually in the like a loan application, right? That's actually very important, right? If you're trying to decide like which loan you should approve, which one you should decline, okay? You need to look for properties, right, of those applications, okay? So what properties will be useful for you to make your decision? So in this case, it's like two classes, risky or safe, right? Weather conditions, you may be monitoring of quite a few things about the weather, and now you're trying to make a classification, right? Is this like sunny, cloudy, snowy, whatever, okay? This actually then relates to the prediction part. Okay, many times when we say we're predicting weather, right? We're not classifying the weather, okay? So general idea is that prediction, okay, refers more to numerical data, okay? So I'm predicting, say, the stock price for tomorrow or next hour, right? Or I'm predicting the traffic volume, or I'm predicting the precipitation, okay? So the general is about continuous value of the functions. Okay, so that's like just the key kind of like difference, okay? So many times, right, if you look at the different applications, right, sometimes you have finite number of classes. That's more of a classification problem, okay? Sometimes you're trying to predict a value, okay? But why do we care about this difference? Classification, when do you claim success? What is considered like success if your classification works? High. So when I give a classification, if the classification matches the actual class label, right? I'm correct. Okay, because I have categorical values. Now with the numerical values, if I predict, say, the stock price will be $122.7, okay? Do I care about the exact match of that value for the prediction? Well, if you get the exact match, that's probably still good, right? But it's okay if you're just a little bit off. So you care more about the error rather than the exact match, right? Make sense? So that's why we're kind of trying to make this like separation here, right? So when you consider your model, like what kind of model can work with what kind of data, it's like categorical, numerical, right? But also it's about when you evaluate your model, right? Do you use accuracy, something like an exact match, right? Or how often you actually match exactly versus how close you get to the actual value, okay? All right, so that's classification versus prediction. Okay, but now let's focus a little bit more on classification. Okay, as we have said, with classification, you have the predefined labels, right? Because you need to tell me, right, which classes, how many classes I'm working with, which classes I'm working with, and you need to give me some examples, right, about which class has what. Because you cannot tell me like, oh, separate, like I want you to classify dog versus a cat, but you need to give me examples, right, with certain properties. Okay, so that's the general idea about the classification, because you need this learning phase, right? I need to learn about the labels. I need to learn about the properties of the objects that belong to different classes. Okay, so this is also where you're using the training set, your class label, to build a model. Okay, and then of course then you can use a model for testing, right? So once you have the model, okay, now for your model to work, right, then now you're giving the properties of the object. In this case, of course, you don't know the label yet, right? That's why you need to do the classification to determine the label, okay? So naturally, right, so when you look at the classification, you always start with a training set, right? I have an example, like on the top right, okay? This is based about like different kind of like weather conditions, and then you're trying to decide whether you play golf or not, right? How many classes do I have in this case? 3? So I'm trying to decide whether I want to play golf or not. 2, right? Yes or no, right? So your decision is the last column. That's your label, okay? And then my training set has already given me some examples about, okay, there are different like combination of the weather conditions, and then this is the actual label whether they play golf or not, right? Okay, with that, I want to train my model, right? So that's my training instance, goes into the model training process. Now I have a model. Model cannot be used on the test instance, okay? So apparently it's very important that these two can use the same set for both. Why not? If you already know the label, right? What's the point of building the model, right? So it's very important, right? It seems straightforward, but it actually, if you're not careful, you may be making that mistake, right? Because naturally you want to say, I want to take the data set, I want to throw it into my modeling process, I'll get like my model, and then I test it on the test set. So make sure you have clear separation, okay? Training set and the test set. Your training process should not see the test cases, okay? All right. So with that, right, and now you have a way of like trying to build your model and test your model, okay? Now this also connects to the term supervised learning versus unsupervised learning, okay? So general idea, right, supervised means that you have some guidance, right, supervision, okay? And that's why like classification is considered supervised learning, because you have those training data with the model labels, right, the class labels, right? That's the supervision you're getting, okay? If you look at my small figure there, if you could just give you those data points without the colors, okay? Then I would say go find like some classes, okay? That means I'm not giving you any prior knowledge about the classes. Instead, you need to find it, okay? And this is what we're referring to as unsupervised learning, okay? Clustering, so that's what we're going to talk about as another core technique, okay? So at a high level, right, classification, you have the training data, you have supervision, it's supervised learning. You have this training process for you to build your model so you can test it somewhere else, right? With clustering, you're provided with the data, but there's no supervision, meaning that I'm just giving you the data. You do whatever, right? So you figure out whether there's some pattern in the data. Okay? So with the classroom, the general idea is that I give you all this data, and you're trying to assign them, right? Or identify whether there's some class. Sometimes it's just purely uniform or random. You don't see anything. But in many real-world cases, there are some grouping effect. The question is how do you find it? Okay? And as you can see in this case, visualization is very helpful, right? Can really help you to identify whether there are some kind of classroom effect. Okay? Now, we'll talk about clustering later, right? So let's focus on classification. Okay? So this is again like the scenario, like before I even build a model, I need to know like how to claim success, right? So what are the things that's important when I'm designing my model, when I'm evaluating it? Okay? Depending on your actual usage case, right? Some of those metrics may be more important than the other. Okay? So sometimes you're doing some kind of trade-off. Okay? But you need to understand what they are, right? Accuracy. Accuracy is important. I said like if it's a classification, you care about how often you can classify, right? Determine the correct label. Okay, how often you miss. Okay, but if you're talking about predictions, it's about how close you get to the actual value. Okay, speed is important. Okay, sometimes right you say, oh, I have all the time in the world. Fine, take your time, do it. Okay, but a lot of times you're trying to make a decision soon. Okay, so think about like a fraud detection. Okay, this is actually like something like usually like transaction, like say credit card transactions. It's happening very quickly, right? And usually you need to detect and maybe decline that like transaction if you can detect it right away. Okay, so it used to be like the more like it takes a week, like it's more like after you detect it afterwards that there was something wrong. Okay, nowadays I don't know how many of you had this like experience, right? I know like when I travel, like especially if I travel internationally, I like if I trying to like pay with my credit card, I would get a notification right away. Like this, like is this something, because that thing looks unusual compared to my regular pattern, right? So this is where you really care about the time. Okay, so sometimes we say like what is the time like granularity, right? Is it a real time, near real time? It's okay, you get back to me in a couple of hours. It's fine, you take a whole week, right? Those are all different, right? Depending on your usage case, okay? And that also would determine what kind of methods you would need, right? Because sometimes if you're really like pressed for time, then you may sacrifice your accuracy a little bit. So that means, okay, it's okay that I'm not like the best, like highest accuracy, but I'm very efficient. Sometimes I say, no, don't worry, you can take your time, but I really want the highest accuracy, okay? Robustness, this is actually very important for real world data, okay? Because nowadays, for example, if you go to Kaggle or some like other data set, they have actually nicely cleaned like a data set. You can train a classifier and it works well, right? But in the real world, you have all kinds of issues, okay? So just pay attention to your data set, right? Because the real world data, as we said, is messy. All kinds of issues can come in, okay? So the question is whether your model can work well if you have those kind of noisy data, okay? Interpretability, that's important, right? So you can, as I said, like you can build your model if it's a black box model, meaning that, yeah, I'm giving you kind of classification results. It's mostly correct. That's good, right? I like to use it, but I'm trying to, if I need to depend my life or something important on the decision, I want to have some understanding how it's working and how it's making the decision and how confident, right, I am with this particular model, okay? The last one is a little bit interesting. We're talking about goodness of the rules. This is actually related to our earlier discussion about significance and the redundancy. I can give you a big model, okay? And the model actually may have, like, it's trying to do very complicated things. It works well, but it's too complicated. As a result, right, it may not be efficient. It may make mistakes. It may be overfitting to a particular problem. Okay, so rather we're actually trying to look at models or rules that are simpler, and it's actually easier, like still like works well. Okay, so we'll have some examples later as we go through the different methods. Okay, so let's dive into the first one. Decision tree induction. which is a classic, okay, which has been used broadly and has been shown to work very well. But nowadays, right, with all the machine learning, deep learning advances, decision trees still considered a very useful mechanism to try. Okay, starting with my training set, right? So hopefully now you know how to read a training table, okay? So basically here I have, I think it's a data set about like a population. It's about the age, income, whether they're student or not, and I have the credit rating, and I care about whether they buy a computer or not. Okay, of course, this is from the business point of view, right? You want to identify like users who are likely to purchase a computer, okay? Question one, I do have the customer ID. Can I build a model based on customer ID? Yes or no? Why not? So customer ID is unique to each individual customer. If I build a model, say customer 1 would buy a computer, customer 3 would not buy a computer. Is that helpful? No. Remember earlier, we have to separate your training data with your testing data, right? So if you're using this as your training data and you build that based on the customer ID, that's not helping you because the new data that you'll be testing on will not have the same customer ID, right? Okay, so that's just one thing. So as you're observing those patterns, right? So that's why it helps for you to at least have some understanding of your data set before you jump into a model building process. Okay, you need to have some understanding. Like there are different like features, different like attributes, and they have different properties. Okay. Now, if you just eyeballing this, can you identify anything that may help you? We have a new 14 cases here. It's probably still not easy, right? What if I had give you 1,000 or 1 million? That's a lot, right? So we need an automated process. But this would seem more convenient to look at and apply, right? So just quickly, right? If either you're working with this table and trying to like use it to decide, right, who's going to purchase computer versus this one, okay? So before I say anything, if you just look at this, it's a tree, right? You probably already can figure out how to use this tree to make your decision, right? So that's why it's called decision tree induction, right? It's easy. It's really like easy to use. That's why people like it, right? It's informative. Once you have this tree, right, you can just apply this tree to quickly determine. For example, if I'm a new customer, right, I first ask, okay, what's the age? I have an age grouping, right? And then, for example, this person is like less than 20, 30, sorry, in this case. And then I'll say, are you a student, right? And then if yes, I can already make a decision. So it's actually very simple for you to use this tree, right? This is a simple model, and it's very like easy to use, okay? Question is, how do we do it, right? How do you actually take the training table and convert it into this tree, right? So what are we trying to get to? Instead of like the leaf node is when I make a decision, right? So when you get to the leaf node, that's the very end of the tree, and they say, okay, now I need to classify you as yes or no, purchase a computer or not, right? But before that, I'm asking a few questions, okay? So at every node, this is an attribute. So that means I'm asking about the value of that attribute, right? And then depending on the value of this attribute, I'm doing my branching, right? So you need to decide, so what do we need to decide, right? At each level, you need to decide, okay, which attribute you ask about, okay? And then once you pick the attribute, and then you decide how you branch, right? So you look at the distribution of the attribute values and trying to put them and assign them into different branches, okay? Can I do this in a brute force way? Doable? I can, right? Technically, right, I can just take all the possible combinations. Like each level, I pick an attribute. I figure out all the different options of assigning those attribute values and construct my tree. Okay? So theoretically, you can do it, but you have too many possible combinations, right? Okay? So we cannot do it in a brute force way. Okay? And actually, turns out this problem is NP. Okay? So in the real world, we don't have a very efficient approach if you want to find all the possible, like check all the possible scenarios. Instead, we need to use some kind of heuristics. Okay. Now, how do we do it? So decision tree induction, the basic method, right, is a greedy algorithm. What do we mean by greedy algorithm?
Prioritize what you add or don't add based on cost.
Yeah, so prioritizing what you add or don't add, or in this case, like how you split things, right, based on some kind of estimate of the cost, okay? So greedy generally just says, okay, I cannot guarantee this is the best solution, but heuristically or intuitively, this seems like a good approach, so I want to pick it. Okay, many times when we make decisions, we don't have all the possible scenarios, so we don't have all the information. We try to make a decision, right, given what we have, right? So that is basically the idea. So because it's a greedy algorithm, doesn't guarantee global optimal, okay? The good news is that in the real world, it has been shown that with many scenarios, so decision tree actually has very good results. So that's why it's broadly used, right? It is actually quite effective, okay? So the high-level thing is that it's a tree, right? So it's naturally have this top-down process. Okay, start with the very top, pick an attribute, do the branching, go to your subtree, and continue. So it's a top-down process. It's recursive, meaning that once you get the subtree, you do the same process with the subset, right? Okay, and also because you have subtree, you naturally have this divide and conquer. So that means once you branch out, right, they are now independent. You work with the subtrees separately. Okay, so once you follow one branch, you don't care about the other branches because now you're already within that subset of scenarios. Okay, two main things, right? At each level, you need to pick the node which corresponds to an attribute, right? So you need to decide which attribute to select, okay? And then given that attribute, by looking at the type of possible values, you need to decide how you split, okay? Binary attribute is easy, yes or no, great, right? When you have a categorical, probably still fine. You can have maybe one per possible value, okay? But when you have numeric, then you need to have some way of deciding how to split, okay? So this gets to the question about how you decide, right, your splitting process, okay? Simple ones, right? Actually, I think I'll bring this out, right? If it's a discrete valued, okay, you can have one branch per value, okay? But that may become too many, so sometimes you can do a little bit okay? So when we talk about discretization, right? So let's say if you have group certain values together, okay, and the others. I don't know whether you can read it. It's probably a little bit small. But for example, have a color, right? Have color of different colors. Okay, so this could be color of the vehicle, for example, right? If you're trying to talk about whether customers are more likely to pick one color, right? If they're likely to purchase this vehicle or not. Now you look at the color, you look at the make and the model, or maybe the year, or certain features, right? So you are trying to decide, right? What are most important attributes that your customers look at, and different customers may look at, right? So color is one, let's say, okay? You can do one color per branch, okay? That's fine if you only have a few options, okay? But sometimes you may see grouping may actually be useful if you have too many colors, okay? That's one. If you have continuous values, right? Of course, in this case, you cannot do one value per branch. It cannot be too many. That's infinite, potentially, right? So now we're talking about splitting point, okay? So with splitting point, general ideas you want to do if it's a numeric, right? You sort it in some value and you pick a point. So everybody goes to the left, that's one branch. Everybody to the right is another branch, okay? You can potentially do multiple branch, but the general idea is that you want to split the continuous spectrum of your values, okay? So if you read that, like my income, right, I may pick a splitting point, okay? But again, the idea is that why do you pick that one, right? Because this is the case you cannot enumerate, right? There are just too many options, okay? So this is where it makes sense for you to look at distribution. Remember what we're doing, right, with the statistical analysis, right? You want to plot, this is the homework 1 or 2, I'm trying to remember. But once you can plot the distribution of your values, right, look at it, or calculate something, then you have a better sense about how best to split your values, okay? So that's why now, like, we'll talk about the techniques, but it's the reasoning you need to do with your actual data, with your actual analysis, okay? Sometimes, right, you can do, like, even if it's a discrete value, even you have just a few, potential values, you may just do grouping, okay? So this is what we call, like, it's like subset thing, okay? So for example, with my color, right, instead of like one color per branch, I would say, okay, maybe red and, I don't know, purple, dark purple, maybe something that's more similar, so it makes sense to put it together. Or you're talking about like a computer science, like a BS, BE, maybe they're similar enough, so I will kind of group them together, okay? So here, one, you can do this based on some domain knowledge, right? So it makes sense to group those together, they're similar. Or like based on your analysis or your data distribution, say, yeah, they're close, right? So you can do some grouping, okay? Again, these are just different approaches, right? So it's about like making your own decision. Sorry, right? This is usually not one rule that fits everybody. So you just need to know the differences, right? And how you make a decision given your particular data set and the question you have. All right. So we talk about the whole process, right? Towards the end, right? At the end, the leaf node, right? That's when you stop, okay? So leaf node is like, okay, if I come to a subtree, and my current node, everybody has the same class label. Because remember, this is a training set, right? You have the corresponding class label. So if you get to a subset, this is a subtree, and then now everybody has the same label, I'm done, right? I can just use that label, okay? If you keep going, right, you may just like take too many like layers. So sometimes you will just do a majority voting. So that means, yeah, I'm not done yet, meaning that my subset, subtree, is still mixed with different class labels. But I have already used all the attributes, meaning that I ask all the questions, right? I don't have another, there's no point of repeating an attribute question, right? So if I have used all the attributes, I'm still not like arriving at a clean, uniform class. Then I will just use a majority voting. So that means, yeah, it's not perfect, but once you get to this subset, most of the time, it's this class label. You're good, right? And of course, no samples left. That means if you're empty, right? If you get to the point that you ask this branching, and that branching down there, you don't have any value, like any sample that has that particular value, then again, you're done, okay? So that's the whole process, okay? Top down, building up your tree recursively, okay? Using the attribute selection, attribute split. You stop when you're at like one of those cases, okay? Before we show you an example of actually how to do it, right? Let's quickly talk about the pros and cons, okay? We'll be actually talking about quite a bit, right? Whenever we introduce a method, we'll talk about the high-level ideas, okay? Give you a sense of how it works. But then more importantly, we want to understand the properties, right? Because the properties would allow you to decide whether a particular method is suitable for the problem you have at hand, okay? So I have listed quite a few, okay? I hope like some of those make sense to you just by reading it, okay? First one, white box, okay? Compared to black box, okay? White box means that I can show you the whole tree, and I will show you basically how I'm going to use the tree to make a decision. You can follow the tree, right? You know exactly what is happening, right? Okay? So this is very useful, okay? I say like it's easy to explain, even for non-expert. This is also related to the interpretability part, right? I can interpret the model. I have a good understanding of how it's working. Implementation is easy. Okay, it's just a tree, recursive tree construction process. Okay, and like you can probably find quite a few implementations, and they're reasonably efficient. Okay, can tolerate missing data. Okay, because earlier we said like if you come to one subtree and like you don't have all the detailed information, if it's a missing data, as long as the majority is there, you would still be able to make that a decision, right? So that like it's a reasonably robust, even if you don't have like all the complete information. No need to normalize data. That's important because every time I work with one attribute, right? Okay, because my branching is based on one attribute value actually at each level. Okay, Because earlier we say when you have different attributes and the attribute like values are all over the place, you need to do normalization before you can combine them, right? But in this case, because I'm working with each attribute at a time, this is also convenient, okay? Non-parametric is simple. We'll actually learn later, like for example, clustering. Like many times you need to know how many clusters you're working with, okay? But in this case, right, I don't know how many levels I need to go, but I basically just work with my my data set, right? Just continue the process. I don't need any prior setting of like how many layers or how many like branches to use, okay? Different attribute type. Again, as I said, right, your branching depends on each attribute, and you can have your specific branching based on the attribute and attribute values you have. Great. Cons? Anything comes to your mind before I flip to the next slide? We mentioned earlier it's a greedy algorithm, right? That's one. Yes?
So we're probably not going to find like the global optimal solution, but the local
Yeah.
one?
Right. So yes. So it's a greedy algorithm. Doesn't guarantee global optimality. Okay. So it may not give you the best performance. Okay. So that's the second bullet, right? Accuracy may not be that good, right? As I said, like depending on your data set, it may be, but generally we say like it has been working pretty well, right? But really doesn't guarantee its best, and sometimes it actually may be stuck in the local optimal. Okay, that's one. Also, the sensitive to noise. Okay, we said it's generally okay with missing data, but if you have noise, right? Remember, we're doing this divide and conquer, right? So if you have too much noise, once I make a branching decision, I will continue that way, right? So I don't go back and maybe recheck, right? So if there's some kind of skewed data due to noise in your data set, that actually may skew the construction of your tree, okay? Greedy, I already talked about. Overfitting. How many have heard the term overfitting? Okay, you know what it is? So when you build a model, right, you're using training data, okay? Overfitting means that your model is too specific. It's very specific to the data set you have, okay? So for example, like my customer ID at the set, right? If I build my model using the customer ID information, right, it will work perfectly with my training set, right? Because it would give me the direct answer right away, but it'd be very bad for any kind of new data it hasn't seen, okay? So similar with the decision tree, if you think about it, I'm talking about the branching conditions, right? If I'm being too specific, that means like I'm asking, for example, like the annual income, right? Annual income is one like branching, but I could have, say, very specific, for example, like instead of 50K, I'm asking, like, say, yeah, whether it's a 50K or 51K, 52K, whatever. So then you have some very specific things. So you have because if you're being too specific, your branching, right, becomes very specific, and that may fit for certain types of data only, okay? And if you want to have like other data sets, because I care less about a 51K versus 52K. It's more about 50K versus 100K maybe, okay? So that again goes back to the fact is that like if you're training your data, right, with some very specific, and your model actually gets to like picks out some of the very specific information that may or may not be relevant for the actual problem, that will make your like model performing not good in a more generalized data set. Okay, so here, if I can like trying to illustrate, just like I have one R1, R2, so those are the different things, but you can see like I'm trying to make some very meticulous kind of branching to get to that like that narrow band, okay? Sometimes it may be important, right? So you may say there's a lot of occurrence there, I really need to get that right, but sometimes, no, it's probably okay, that's why I say the majority voting makes sense, okay? All right, now let's look at how we actually do this, right? So this is what I have shown earlier. I have my table, I got my tree. How do we do it? Okay, remember we have our attribute selection and attribute split, okay? Starting point, right? So this is called information gain, okay? So there are a few notations here. Let's start like with some explanation. D is my data set, that's my training set, okay? I have a few classes. So I have M classes, okay? So C sub I, so that's the ith class, okay? So since I have a training table, I know like which objects belong to which class, okay? So I can already calculate P sub I, which is the occurrences, like how often do I see like a particular class label in my data set, right? So you say I have 1,000 like customers in my data set, right? I say like 400 of them purchase a computer, right? So that is my like probability, right, for a particular class label, okay? So with that, like you can compute your information. Okay, so this is related to the information theory. Basically, it's looking at like the probability or the relative distribution of things belonging to different class labels. Okay, so what you're doing is really using you go through the M classes, right? So the P sub I and the log base 2 of P sub I. So that just gives you a bit of kind of distribution, right? So the general idea is that if things are kind of uniformly spread, so like half-half split, for example, right? That is the highest information because it's very different, diverse, right? If your data set has like all just say one class and almost none of the other one, then it's mostly uniform. You don't have a lot of information. So that means like I can probably just do a random guess, right? And I will be right. Okay, so this is related to this like entropy, right? So the general idea is, okay, I know there's some distribution, some mixture of classes in my data set, right? I need to determine the actual class label, okay? So if it's all kind of equally kind of like a proportion, then it's the hardest for me to make a decision. Make sense? So I'm trying to reduce that, right? Because there's too much, so the entropy is about really how much kind of variability or like information in your data set. So what I need to do, right? Now say I have D, I'm trying to compete, like select an attribute A, okay? And with attribute A, so here, like for example, I'm using kind of some branching, say just like a few numerical value, right? I have A1, A2, and AV, right? So based on that, I divide them into the subsets, right? Okay, so I get the D sub J. So that means using like a particular value here of attribute A, I have the corresponding branch, right? That's the subtree. Everybody with that particular value for attribute A. Okay, so now I have my update. So this is my original one, right? Once I use the A to split, and now I look at the individual, so this is a subset, okay? I combine that together. Now I have my new information, okay? As I said, my goal is to reduce the information or reduce the variability, right? Because ultimately, when I get to a subset where everybody has the same class label, I'm done, right? So I want to basically try to reduce. So this is what we're talking about again, okay? So we're talking about starting with this. That's a whole data set, okay? And then I use A to split them into branches and the combined like information. So I want to reduce this, okay? So if you have, say, two different attributes, A and B, okay, and I compute the gain value, do I choose the one with a higher gain or smaller gain? You're trying to reduce. Everybody start at a D, right? That's the whole set. I either use attribute A, I can reduce it here, or I can use attribute B, I reduce it down here. Do I want a more reduction or less reduction? Sorry? More. Because you're trying to make it more uniform, okay? When it's uniform, you have the lowest information, okay? So if you're comparing two attributes, you want to pick the attribute that will give you more reduction of the information. Make sense? Okay, let's do it. Take the table, okay, the process. As I said, like we need to start with the first one, right? So I know that I have two classes, right? Buying computer or not. If you count it, you say, okay, 9 of them purchased a computer, 5 of them didn't. Okay, the total number is 14. Okay, so I start with my first calculation, information D. This P sub I, so that's basically the probability of each class occurring. Okay, so in this case, I would have 9 over 14 versus 5 over 14, right? Okay, so you put all this together. Okay, so this is the way I'm just writing it. I have basically a split of a 9 and a 5. Okay, when you have that, you calculate, plug that in, you get like the initial information value 0.94. That's our base. Okay, that's when I have everybody, no splitting yet. Okay, now I'm trying to decide, right? I want to pick an attribute and then calculate if I use that attribute, how I'm going to like improve, right? Or reduce the information. Okay, so here I use age, right? So the age, I have my grouping, right? So I think it's like a young, middle, or senior. Actually, I have the numbers there, right? At the most 30, between 31 and 40, or more than 40, okay? Once you have that, right, based on the value, the branching, you basically take the 14 of them, and they will go into one of those branches based on their age information. Make sense? Right? Once they're in, now you look at the data set. You would still have the class labels, okay? And now you see they have a different split, right, within those subsets. Okay, so I will calculate, right, the new information once I have used a particular attribute to do the split, okay? So this is my summarized table. If I'm using age, I have the PN, so positive and negative, okay? So that basically says that like if the age is at most 30, I have a 2-3 split, meaning that I have 5 people total going into that subset, sub-branch. 2 of them purchased a computer, 3 of them didn't. Make sense? Right? Okay. And now I just need to combine all that together, right? So I'm now calculating information of D by using age as my branching condition, right? So I have 3 cases, right? So 5 of them go into the first one with a 2-3 split. 4 of them, the second branch, 4-0 split, okay? And then 5 of them with a 3-2 split, okay? So if you do the calculation, you get the value of 0.694, okay? And now I just need to calculate the gain, okay? So for the first one, age, I said the gain is 0.246. And I would do the same process, right, using the other attributes, income, being a student or not, credit rating. And I have calculated their gain values, right? Which one do we pick? Higher gain or lower gain? I have 4, right? I have 4 possible choices for the attributes. Which one do I pick? Higher gain value or lower gain value is best? Remember, we're reducing the information. So the gain is between the baseline, everybody's together, after the branching. So I want a bigger gain so I can reduce the information. So which one do I pick? Age, right? Age has much higher gain compared to the other ones, okay? Now, once I have picked age as the first level, now I get to the second level. Can I reuse those calculations? Can I reuse those gain values for the other attributes? Yes or no? Because this is a calculate based on D, right? Once I go to the subtree, is the D the same? No, right? Because when you do the branching, each branch is a subtree, is a subset of your original data set. So you cannot reuse the gain values you have calculated in the previous level. Now you have to repeat, right? Use the new subset as your D in the calculation. Make sense? Right? Okay. So we talk about like information gain. We say that, okay, great, right? Because information gain basis try to assign the branches based on the values. So if you have a few unique values, you have 1 branch per per value, right, for the attribute. But when you have continuous value, right, customer ID, annual like annual income or whatever, what other things, right? So if it's a continuous value, then you need to do some splitting, right? So we have salary if it's continuous, like so here they'll talk about a binary splitting. So I basically just need to sort the values into some kind of like increasing order, pick a split, like splitting point. But this is hard, right? As I said, if you need to enumerate all the ones, that's too long, takes too long, right? So usually you need to look at, right? like what may be a like a reasonable split. Because here say, yeah, I want to pick the midpoint with the minimal information gain, but that's hard, right? There'll be too many choices. Okay, so sometimes we choose like maybe the middle point, right? Or if you look at the distribution, you kind of trying to pick one that is reasonable. And sometimes you can start with a larger like strides and then refine once you have something that is more specific. Okay, so there are a few things you need to consider, but the general idea is that when you have the numerical value, right, you need a way to choose your splitting point. Okay, so we have actually we're out of time, so we'll stop here. So we have talked about decision tree. We introduced one method. We'll continue with more discussion. Okay, that's all for today.